The Tor Malin combat arena was not a building so much as a confession carved into the side of a dead moon, a vault of fused basalt and pressure-cured ceramic that the Concordant generals had spent 4 centuries reinforcing against the only thing they feared, which was the possibility that one of their own recruits might learn something they had not first approved. Inside its ribbed dome, 10,000 training drills had been run, recorded, scored, and filed under the cold logic of a system that measured worth in survivable damage. The arena did not teach courage. It manufactured compliance through the careful, repeated application of terror, and the generals who ran it understood that a soldier who had been frightened in precisely the right sequence would never again imagine a better way to fight. That was the design. That was the whole monolithic point of the place, and for 400 years nothing had threatened it. Then the human arrived, and within a single training cycle, the generals did something they had never done in the institution's history. They issued a standing order, signed by all 3 of them, that no human would ever again be permitted to enter a live drill. The order did not explain itself. Orders of that severity rarely did, but the recordings that prompted it were sealed under a classification so high that even the instructors who taught in the arena were forbidden to review them, and the reason for that secrecy is the reason this account exists at all. His name was Eli Brandt, and the manifest that delivered him to Tor Malin described him as a logistics liaison, junior grade, attached to the human delegation as an observer with no combat authorization. He was 34 years old, of unremarkable height by the standards of his own species, and noticeably small against the Concordant soldiers who towered over him in the corridors, and he carried himself with the unhurried economy of a man who had spent most of his life fixing things that other people had broken, and then walked away before anyone thought to thank him. He did not request access to the drills. He did not lobby the instructors or petition the command structure, or make any of the noises a recruit makes when he wants to prove himself. He simply watched. For the first 11 days he sat in the upper gallery with a ration cup of bitter root tea cooling in his hands and observed the drills the way a mechanic observes an engine that is running slightly wrong, with a patience that the Concordant officers mistook for placidity, and which was in fact the most dangerous thing in the room. The Concordant were a tall people, broad through the shoulders, and built around a dense secondary musculature that let them carry armor a human could not lift, with skin the color of weathered slate and eyes that held a faint internal luminescence, a soft cyan glow that brightened with exertion and dimmed toward sleep. They had evolved on a high-gravity world of seismic instability, and everything about them was engineered by deep time for endurance under crushing load. They did not flinch. They did not panic. Their nervous systems were buffered against shock by a chemical cascade that flooded the body with calm under threat, an adaptation that had kept their ancestors alive beneath collapsing ridges and which had, over the long climb to civilization, become the cornerstone of their military philosophy. A Concordant soldier under fire grew calmer, slower, more precise. It was a magnificent advantage. It was also, though none of them had ever framed it this way, the exact shape of their blindness. 3 generals governed Tor Malin, and they were not interchangeable. General Vorath Seal commanded the arena's combat doctrine, a heavy-bodied veteran whose left eye had been replaced with a tactical optic that read kinetic vectors in real time, and who had not lost a strategic engagement in 60 standard years. He had come up through the arena himself, had crossed his own breaking curve as a recruit, and been remade by the crossing, and he believed in the place the way a priest believes in his temple, which is to say he believed in it more completely, because it had once nearly destroyed him. He regarded the human's assignment to the observation gallery as a diplomatic courtesy that would cost him nothing, and end quietly, a small administrative kindness extended to a delegation that would conclude its business and depart, and he had filed the human under the same low priority he reserved for ceremonial visits and supply audits. He did not watch the gallery. He had no reason to. General Issa Korath oversaw the medical and biological divisions, a leaner figure whose hands were said to have rebuilt more wounded soldiers than any surgeon in the Concordant fleet, and who watched the human with a flicker of professional curiosity she did not yet have a name for. Her work had given her a particular intimacy with the moment a body decided whether to live, and she had learned over a long career that the decision was never loud, that the soldiers who survived were not the ones who screamed, but the ones who went quiet and methodical in the dark, and something in the human stillness reminded her of that quiet, though she could not yet say what. And General Dovin Mail held the 3rd chair, the administrative seat, the one that controlled the arena's contracts, its supply lines, its quiet financial arteries, and it was Mail who had arranged for the human delegation to be housed at Tor Malin in the first place, and Mail, who had reasons for that arrangement that the other two generals did not know and were never meant to discover. Mail was the least imposing of the three, narrow through the shoulders for a concordant, his luminescence dimmer than most, a soldier who had risen not through combat but through the patient mastery of the structures that kept combat supplied, and the other two generals had long since stopped thinking of him as a fighter and started thinking of him as a kind of necessary furniture, the chair that signed the requisitions so they did not have to. It was a mistake. It was the same mistake the arena made about quiet things, the assumption that what did not threaten loudly did not threaten at all, and Mail had spent years learning to live comfortably inside it. The drills themselves were brutal in a controlled clinical fashion. A recruit or a squad of recruits was sealed into the arena floor and subjected to a programmed environment of escalating hazard, simulated artillery, collapsing terrain, false signals and live fire suppression rounds, calibrated to wound rather than kill but calibrated. The recruits all understood, with a margin thin enough to remind them that the calibration could fail. The point was not victory. The arena was not winnable. The point was to measure how a soldier degraded under sustained fear, and the scores that mattered were not kills or objectives but the precise moment at which a recruit's discipline began to fracture. The generals called this the breaking curve. Every soldier had one. The arena existed to find it, document it, and use it. On the 12th day, a squad of 4 concordant recruits failed a drill in a manner that should have been impossible, and the human in the gallery set down his tea and leaned forward for the first time. The squad had held a clean defensive position for 6 minutes, a fused basalt overhang that gave them cover from 3 angles and a clear field across the only approach, and the arena had thrown everything its hazard library contained at them, without moving them an inch. They had absorbed a simulated artillery walk. They had ridden out a terrain collapse that buried one of their own flanking lines. They had, in short, done everything 4 centuries of doctrine had trained them to do, and they had done it with the calm, flooded steadiness that made the concordant such formidable defenders. Then the arena had planted a single false signal 300 meters off their flank, a phantom distress beacon broadcasting the slow, specific pulse of a soldier down and bleeding, and the squad had abandoned the position in under 10 seconds. All 4 of them. Trained soldiers with decades of conditioning had left an unbreakable position to chase a wounded comrade who did not exist, and they had been cut down in the open by suppression fire from an angle the overhang would have protected them from completely, and the whole reversal had taken 90 seconds from the moment the beacon began to pulse. The instructors logged it as a discipline failure, a lapse of tactical judgment under stress, and they noted in the file that the squad had allowed emotional priority to override defensive logic. Eli Brandt logged it as something else entirely, and when General Korath passed through the gallery an hour later on her way to the medical bay, said the only unsolicited thing he had said since arriving. "Your beacon's broadcasting on the casualty band," he said. "You taught them their whole lives to never leave a wounded man. Then you put a fake wounded man in the open and called it a test of discipline. That's not a discipline failure. That's the training working exactly the way you built it. You're punishing them for the thing you made them." Korath stopped. Her eyes brightened, the cyan luminescence climbing as her attention sharpened, and for a moment she studied the small creature in the gallery. As though a piece of arena equipment had begun to speak, the recruits had failed the drill. That was the data. That the human had looked at the same recording and seen not a failure of the recruits, but a failure of the arena was a perspective that had never once in 400 years appeared in the after-action files. She did not answer him. She filed the observation, and she filed the quiet, professional discomfort that came with it, and she went to find General Seal. Sel was unimpressed. The arena had been validated across 4 centuries and 10,000 drills, and the notion that its core methodology contained a flaw that a junior human logistics clerk had identified from a gallery seat was, to him, an insult dressed as an insight. But Korath was not a person whose observations he could dismiss without cost, and so a decision was made, in the way that institutional decisions are always made, as the path of least resistance disguised as rigor. They would let the human run a drill, not to prove him right, to prove him wrong, to put the small, confident creature on the arena floor and let the system do to him what the system did, to everyone, and then to file the recording and close the question and never speak of it again. General Mail, when consulted, approved the plan with an enthusiasm the other 2 found mildly excessive and attributed to administrative boredom. It was not boredom. Mail had spent 11 days waiting for a reason to put the human where the human could be observed under maximum stress, in a sealed environment, where an accident, should one become necessary, would be entirely deniable. The arena killed recruits. It did so rarely, and within tolerance, and the records were sealed. A human death on the arena floor would be a tragedy, a diplomatic incident, and an unsolvable mystery, and Mail had already begun to compose the apology he would deliver to the human delegation with a grief he did not feel. This was the part the recruits never saw, the part the arena's reputation, as a hard but honest crucible, was constructed precisely to conceal. 3 years earlier, an auditor from the Concordant fleet had come to Tormalin to reconcile its supply manifests against its expenditures, and the auditor had noticed that the arena was being billed for combat consumables, munitions, medical stock, and environmental reagents at a volume that exceeded its drill schedule by a factor of nearly 3. The discrepancy was not large in absolute terms. It was large enough. The auditor had filed a preliminary note and requested the raw procurement records, and 40 days later the auditor's transport had suffered a navigation failure during a routine transit and been lost with all aboard, and the preliminary note had been reclassified as resolved and sealed. General Devon Mail had not killed the auditor with his own hands. He had simply ensured that the navigation beacons along the transport's route reported a position that was 40 meters off true, in a corridor where 40 meters was the difference between a clean transit and a fatal one, and then he had let the physics of space do what physics does to a ship that trusts a lie. The human delegation had been routed to Tormalin to negotiate a munitions supply contract, the same contract that papered over the missing threefold expenditure, and Mail needed the negotiation to conclude on his terms. An observant human asking the wrong questions about consumable volumes was precisely the variety of problem that the arena floor could be made to solve. Eli Brandt knew none of this when he descended to the arena floor on the 14th day, and yet he moved through the staging corridor like a man reading a room for exits. He had asked one question before the drill, directed to the technician sealing his environmental suit, and the question was whether the suppression rounds were drawn from the same lot as the ones used in the recruit drills. The technician, who had no reason to lie and no awareness of what the truth concealed, told him they were drawn from a separate reserve, a fresher lot, requisitioned that morning. Eli nodded and said nothing, and he filed the fact in the same quiet place where he had filed the casualty band beacon, and he stepped onto the arena floor with a calm that the watching generals read 3 different ways. Seal read it as ignorance. Korath read it as the steadiness of a man who had decided something. Mail read it as the unhurried walk of prey that did not yet understand it had already been chosen. The first drill began, and it lasted 11 minutes, and at the end of it the arena's automated systems flagged an anomaly, and the drill terminated early, and General Seal rose from his chair without a word and walked to the control station to see what had broken. Nothing had broken. The human had won, in the sense that the arena permitted winning, which was to say he had survived the full hazard sequence without crossing his braking curve, and he had done it not by enduring the fear, the way a concordant soldier endured it, but by simply declining to participate in the emotional logic arena was built to exploit. The phantom distress beacon had broadcast on the casualty band, and Eli had ignored it, because he had told General Korath 2 days earlier exactly what it was. The collapsing terrain had funneled him toward a kill zone, and he had read the funnel from the way the rubble was shaped and gone the other way. Overground, the arena designers had assumed no one would choose, because it was slower and harder and exposed. The suppression rounds had tracked him, and he had used the slowness of his own movement, the very thing the Concordant would have considered weakness, to stay inside the round's minimum tracking arc where their predictive targeting could not lead him. He had not been faster than the system. He had been illegible to it. The arena was a machine built to break a specific kind of mind, and the human did not have that kind of mind, and so the machine had nothing to grip. But that was not the anomaly that terminated the drill. The anomaly was that, with 4 minutes left in the hazard sequence, Eli Brandt had stopped moving toward survival and started moving toward a sound. A recruit observation pod, a sealed armored shell from which a single Concordant trainee was meant to watch the drill and learn, had developed a slow atmospheric leak, a hairline fracture in a seal that the maintenance logs claimed had been replaced, and which, the records would later show, had not. The trainee inside, a young soldier named Resh Talon, was losing pressure at a rate that his calm-flooded nervous system was failing to register as urgent, because the Concordant adaptation that kept them composed under threat also dulled their response to slow, quiet danger, the kind that did not spike the senses. He was, in the most literal sense, drowning in his own composure, and the human, 300 meters away on a live arena floor with suppression rounds still tracking him, had heard the change in the pod's ventilation tone, a shift of perhaps 30 hertz, and had turned away from his own survival and walked into the open toward a sound that none of the watching soldiers had even noticed. For 3 full seconds, absolute silence held in the control gallery. Then Eli reached the pod, and he did not waste motion. He read the fracture by the faint condensation freezing along its edge, and he pulled a length of sealant tape from his suit's repair kit, the kit every environmental suit carried, and that no recruit had ever once used because recruits were trained to fight, not to fix. He pressed the tape along the fracture. He cracked the pod's manual override, the one buried under a panel that the trainees were taught existed but never drilled to use. He equalized the pressure by hand, slow and even, because a fast equalization would have ruptured the young soldier's inner ears. He tapped the pod's diagnostic to confirm the seal was holding, and then he stepped back, and he did not look up at the gallery, and he did not raise a hand or call for acknowledgement, and he returned to the center of the arena floor to finish a drill that the system had already decided he could not win. That was when the arena terminated the drill, because its safety protocols designed to halt a sequence the instant a trainee was in genuine danger had finally registered the pod's pressure loss, 4 full minutes after the human had heard it. The generals had not built a machine that could notice a quiet thing dying. The human had. General Korath was the first to reach the floor. She found the young soldier Resh Talon, conscious and stabilized, his pod sealed by a strip of tape that no concordant engineer would have trusted, and which had nonetheless held. She found the human standing at the arena's center, unhurt, his ration cup nowhere in evidence, his expression the same mild attentiveness he had worn in the gallery. She asked him why he had broken from the drill. The question mattered to her, because in her medical files she kept a private taxonomy of why soldiers acted, and she had never been able to file an action that gained the actor nothing. He was leaking, Eli said. Slow leak. Your people don't hear slow. You hear loud. I figured I had about 90 seconds before the tape wouldn't matter, and the drill was going to end the same whether I finished it or not. He paused, and then he added the thing that General Korath would carry for a long time afterward. Where I'm from, we made our living off the things other people left for broken. You learn to listen for the quiet stuff. The loud stuff's already past saving. She did not answer. She filed it. The arena ran the human 3 more times over the following cycle, because Sihel was a thorough man and one anomaly was but 4 would be a pattern, and a pattern he could either disprove or be forced to believe. The second drill ended in 9 minutes. The third ended in 7. By the third, the recruits assigned to observe had stopped treating the human as a curiosity and started treating him as a problem they did not have a category for, and the concordant did not enjoy lacking a category. Each drill, the human declined the arena's emotional traps, read its physical geometry, and somewhere in the sequence diverted from his own survival to fix a thing that was breaking quietly, a thing the system had not flagged and the soldiers had not heard. In the second drill, a recruit's exo joint seized at the knee, locking the young soldier into a half-crouch in the open, with suppression rounds beginning to track his stillness, and the recruit had done what his training demanded, which was to hold position and return fire and wait for an extraction that the arena had no intention of providing. Eli reached him in the gap between 2 suppression sweeps, knelt in the exposed lane, and freed the locked actuator with a thin pry he had bent that morning from the handle of a ration cup, working the jammed servo by feel, because the recruit's armor blocked his view of the joint, and he had the leg moving again in under 30 seconds and was gone before the next sweep crossed the lane. He said nothing. The recruit, who had been trained to expect death in that lane, finished the drill and could not afterward explain to the instructors why the human had done it, because the only honest answer was that the human had not appeared to consider not doing it. In the third drill, a trainee's suit regulator went sour, the oxygen mix sliding toward a concentrations that would have put the young soldier to sleep in the open and kept him asleep, and the trainee's calm, flooded nervous system had read the creeping dizziness as fatigue rather than danger, and had simply slowed down, settling toward the ground with the unhurried ease of a man lying down to rest. Eli heard the regulator before he saw the trainee, the wet catch in its cycling tone, and he crossed 40 meters of contested ground to reach him and rerouted the regulator's intake by hand, talking the half-conscious soldier through the breaths in a flat, level voice: in, hold, out, the same cadence a man might use to talk a frightened animal down, while the cover 3 meters away came apart under fire. 3 times he turned from winning to mend, and 3 times the arena terminated early because the human had found the broken thing before the machine did, and 3 times the recruits who watched from the pods felt something rearrange itself in their understanding of what the small creature on the floor actually was. It was in the wreckage of the third drill that the pattern cracked open into something far more dangerous than a methodological flaw. General Korath, reviewing the consumable expenditures for the human's drills against the lot numbers the technician had logged, noticed that the suppression rounds fired during Eli's sequences were drawn from a reserve that did not appear anywhere in the arena's official munitions ledger. They were real, they had real lot numbers, real provenance, real cost, and they were being expended against a single unarmored human at a volume that made no operational sense. Billed to a contract line that Korath, who had no head for finance and had never once read a procurement record, only examined now because the human had asked his quiet question about lot numbers, and the question had lodged in her like a splinter. The numbers did not reconcile. The arena was firing munitions it was not supposed to have, against a target that was not supposed to be there, and the only person at Tor Malin who controlled both the contracts and the reserve was General Dovin Mail. She did not understand yet what she was looking at. She understood that it was wrong, and that the wrongness had a shape, and that the human had handed her the first thread of it without ever knowing what it was attached to. And while she stood in the medical bay with the unreconciled ledger glowing in her hands, 3 corridors away General Mail was reaching the same conclusion she was, from the opposite direction, and arriving at the only solution his logic permitted. The human had survived 3 drills. The human had, in the course of surviving them, demonstrated an attention to quiet broken things that was precisely the attention Mail could not afford turned toward a ledger. The observation gallery, the supply manifests, the munitions reserve, the missing auditor, the contract that had to close, all of it depended on the human delegation concluding their negotiation without anyone among them, developing the habit of listening for the slow leak, and the human had that habit in a degree Mail had never encountered. There would not be a 4th drill, Mail decided, because a 4th drill was a recording and a recording was a witness. There would be an accident in the staging corridor before the next cycle began, and it would be clean. The standing order came first, and it came from Cell, and its timing was an accident of bureaucracy that saved a life. Cell had seen enough. 4 drills, 4 early terminations, 4 demonstrations that the arena's entire validated methodology had been refuted by a creature who weighed less than a concordant soldier's armor. He did not yet believe the human was right about everything. He believed, with the cold honesty that had kept him undefeated for 60 years, that the human was right about enough, and that every additional drill was another recording, proving that the institution Sill had served his whole life had spent 4 centuries measuring the wrong thing. He signed the order to ban humans from the drills, not to protect the human, but to protect the arena, to stop the bleeding of its credibility before the pattern became undeniable in the official record. Korath signed it because it would pull the human off the floor and away from the munitions reserve while she worked out what the ledger meant. Mail signed it because a banned human was a human with no further reason to be near the arena, which meant the staging corridor accident would have to happen tonight, before the ban took administrative effect and the human was relocated to delegation housing beyond his reach. The narrator notes, with the flat precision the moment deserves, that all 3 generals signed the same order for 3 entirely different reasons, and that only one of them knew it was a death warrant. Eli Brandt was in the staging corridor that evening, returning the environmental suit he was no longer authorized to wear when the corridor's atmospheric system began to cycle in a way he did not like. He had spent 4 drills learning the sound of Tor Malin's machinery, the hum of its pumps, the tonal signature of its seals, and the staging corridor's ventilation was running a pressure differential that the arena floor used to flush hazardous reagents, but that had no business operating in an occupied corridor. He heard it the way he heard everything, 30 hertz off true, a quiet wrongness in a system that was supposed to be safe. He did not panic, because panic was not in his working vocabulary. He read the corridor the way he had read the arena, and he understood within the space of a few breaths that the reagent flush was building toward a concentration that a human respiratory system would not survive, and a concordant one would barely notice, and that the override panel that should have let him stop it had been locked out from a control station he could not reach. He did the only thing the situation permitted. He found the broken thing. The corridor's reagent line ran behind a maintenance panel that the concordant, who built everything for soldiers and nothing for mechanics, had secured with a fastener pattern designed to resist battlefield tampering, and which was, to a man who had spent his life opening things that did not want to be opened, a slow and irritating but entirely solvable problem. He pulled the panel. He found the reagent feed. And he did not cut it, because cutting it would have triggered a failsafe that locked the corridor down entirely, sealing him inside with the concentration already building. Instead, he did the thing the arena had never once seen a soldier do, the thing that was the whole of who he was. He repaired the system in the direction of safety. He rerouted the reagent feed back into its reservoir, equalizing the flow by hand, slow and even, bleeding the pressure differential down to nothing over the span of 4 minutes while the air around him hovered at the edge of lethal and his own pulse stayed exactly where it had been when he walked in. He did not flee. Fleeing was loud. He fixed it, because the quiet thing was the one still worth saving. General Korath found him there, because she had come to the staging corridor with the unreconciled ledger, and a question she could no longer hold, and she found the human kneeling at an open maintenance panel, with his hands inside the reagent line, and the corridor's air still faintly bitter with a flush that should not have been running. She understood it in a single glance, because she was a surgeon and she knew the difference between an accident and a wound. The reagent flush, the locked override, the timing, the same evening the ban took effect, the same evening the human would have been beyond reach by morning. She did not need the ledger anymore to know who controlled the corridor's atmospheric systems, and the munitions reserve and the contract and the lockout. She had the shape of it now, complete, and the human had handed her every piece of it without ever once asking her to look. He tried to kill you, she said. It was not a question. Somebody did, Eli said, wiping reagent residue from his hands with the same unhurried economy he did everything. Whoever it was locked the override from a station I couldn't get to. There's about 3 people in this place with that kind of access. He looked at her then, the first time he had ever looked directly at a general, and his expression was not fear and was not triumph, but only the mild, terrible attentiveness of a man who had finished listening and now simply knew. You already figured out the munitions don't add up. That's why you're down here. I'd start with whoever signs the procurement. She did not answer. She had stopped needing to. What followed did not happen on the arena floor, and the narrator declines to stage it as spectacle, because the unmaking of General Dovin Mail was a quiet, administrative, devastating thing, conducted in sealed review chambers and reconciled ledgers, and the slow forensic reconstruction of a navigation failure 3 years old. Korath brought the unreconciled munitions to CL, and CL, who had spent 60 years reading the kinetic truth of a battlefield, found that the same eye served just as well for reading the kinetic truth of a balance sheet, and the two of them followed the missing 3-fold expenditure backward through the contract that papered it over and forward into the transport that had been lost with the auditor aboard. The navigation beacons along that corridor were still logged. The 40-meter discrepancy was still there, frozen in the record, waiting 3 years for someone to listen for the quiet wrong thing. Mail had protected everything except the thing he had assumed no one would ever examine, because the arena had trained every soldier at Tormalin to look for the loud threat, and none of them to hear the slow leak, and Mail had built his entire crime inside that blindness. He had not accounted for the one creature in the institution who heard slow. General Devon Mail was removed from his chair in a proceeding the recruits never witnessed, and the record sealed under a classification even higher than the one that hid the arena's true purpose. He was not executed. The Concordant did not execute their own. They did something their psychology found far heavier, which was to strip him of his function, his access, and his place in the structure that had given his life its only meaning, and to file him away in the cold archive of soldiers who had been found unfit. The auditor's death was reclassified a final time, from resolved to murdered, and the auditor's name was restored to the rolls of the honored dead, and somewhere in the fleet a family received a notice that did not bring anyone back, but did, at last, tell the truth. None of this was shown to the human. He was not a soldier of the Concordant, and the institution's reckoning with itself was not his to witness. He was told only that the matter had been addressed, and he nodded, because he had not done any of it to be thanked, and being thanked had always made him want to leave a room. The ban remained in force. No human ever entered a Tormalin training drill again, and the official reason, the one in the unsealed record, was diplomatic prudence, the avoidance of risk to delegation personnel. The real reason was sealed beside the recordings, and it was this: the arena had been built to measure the breaking curve of soldiers who grew calm, under threat, and a human did not have a breaking curve the arena could find. And worse, a human looked at the arena's entire 400-year methodology and saw a machine that punished soldiers for the best thing in them, the refusal to leave a wounded man, and turned it into a weakness to exploit. The generals could not let that perspective onto the floor again, because every drill the human ran was a recording, and every recording was an argument, and the argument was that the institution had spent 4 centuries perfecting the wrong question. It was easier to ban the human than to answer him, but the arena changed anyway, slowly, in the way that institutions change when they cannot admit they are changing. The observation pods were retrofitted with slow leak sensors, the kind that listened for a 30 Hz shift in a ventilation tone, and no instructor ever explained where the specification had come from. The drills began to score not only how a recruit degraded under fear, but whether, in the degrading, the recruit turned toward a comrade or away, and the after-action files acquired a new column that the old generals would not have understood. The casualty band beacon was quietly removed from the hazard library. None of these changes were attributed to the human, because attributing them would have required admitting he had been right. And the Concordant were not yet a people who could do that out loud. They did it in the specifications instead. They did it in the quiet. On the morning Eli Brandt left Tourmaline, the delegation's transport waited on the moon's surface under a sky the color of cold iron, and the staging corridor where a general had tried to kill him had been scrubbed and resealed and logged as routine maintenance. He carried the same single duffel he had arrived with. He had acquired nothing at the arena and asked for nothing, and the only thing different about him was a faint stiffness in one shoulder from kneeling on basalt to fix things that were not his to fix. He moved through the corridor toward the surface locks with the unhurried economy he had worn the whole time, a small man in an institution built for giants, entirely unremarkable, entirely impossible to break. The young soldier was waiting at the lock. Resh Talon, the trainee from the leaking pod, the first quiet thing the human had heard dying and turned to save, stood at the corridor's end in full uniform, off duty, present for no reason the regulations could explain. He did not make a speech. The Concordant did not make speeches, and this one had been trained his whole life to find the loud threat and had only recently begun, the way the whole arena had begun, to listen for the slow one. He held out a ration cup. It was full and it was hot. The bitter root tea the human had nursed cold in the gallery for 11 days, and the young soldier had made it himself in the manner he had watched the human prefer it, and he held it out across the gap between their two species without a word, because there were no words in his language for the thing he was doing, and he had decided, in the quiet way the human had taught the whole institution to decide things, that the gesture would have to carry it. Eli took the cup. He drank from it once, standing in the lock with the cold iron sky behind him, and he looked at the young soldier the way the young soldier had once been looked at by a system that saw him only as a breaking curve, except the human's look held no measurement in it at all. He handed the cup back. He said the only thing the moment needed, which was not thank you and was not goodbye, but only keep listening for the quiet stuff, and the young soldier closed his luminous eyes once in the concordant gesture that had no human equivalent and meant, as near as the gesture could mean anything, that he would. Then the lock cycled, and the small man stepped through into the cold light, and behind him the arena that had been built to break what it could not understand, kept its sealed recordings and its new sensors and its quiet, unattributed changes, and the young soldier stood at the corridor's end, holding a cup that was still warm, having learned, at last, to hear the thing that the loudest place in the Concordant had spent 400 years teaching everyone to ignore.